Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Although we are trying to put our focus on those guidance department activities posted each day, as far as the Zooms you can join in or the resources they posted, I just, I got to scratch my history itch. So even though we won't have any more kind of assignments geared towards these things, I still just felt like talking more about the American story for you. So these are really just kind of for your own enjoyment. Um, if you have any questions or concerns about your grade, please reach out to me. But I did want to just keep talking about our American story in a few unique ways, and I want to take a little bit to talk to you about a phrase you've probably heard. It's been around the entirety of my life and the entirety of your lives. A phrase, the war on drugs, and now this has been, like I said, something that has defined American social policy on drug use, as we'll learn, really since the 1970s. And it's had some pretty long term impacts on even modern day society. Some people call it the longest standing war America's ever been a part of. And as this cartoon shows, um, every president's tried to tackle the growing use of recreational and what you'd say more like hard or serious. No, I don't want to use the word serious like recreational and serious, but the a variety of different drug dependencies that started to grow through American society, even from the 60s onward. So, like what you see here is you got Johnson, you got Nixon, you got Ford, you got Carter, you got Reagan, you got Bush, and all of them are talking about kind of their solutions to the war on drugs. So, this is by no means an overall story of the war on drugs, but I did pick out a few kind of key moments throughout this kind of 40-year history, 50-year history now, wow, that I think are worth talking about. One is just kind of like the origin of this phrase. It actually comes from 1971 from President Nixon, that the number one public enemy in the US was drug abuse. And it's not necessarily a brand new concept. Think back to the 1920s, right? When we tried out prohibition, America's noble experiment. There's not a brand new mentality of Americans being afraid of what maybe drug use is doing to society, right? Like we kind of been down that road before. But this is more focused on the rise of what are sometimes referred to as like recreational drugs. That's starting to, especially during the 60s, rise up in the public conscious. So Nixon actually declares a war on this. A few years later, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, is created. Still around today. It's an agency in the Department of Justice, and they are the ones really tasked with trying to enforce drug policy in the United States. And what those policies will be will shift pretty radically from era to era, but they have still been kind of that long-standing agency in charge of kind of carrying out policy. Now, these policies will shift pretty dramatically. In 1976, Jimmy Carter actually campaigned and tried to push decriminalization on um, drugs such as marijuana and others. This is a pretty good quote of his. Penalties against possession of a drug should not be more damaging to an individual than the drug itself. Now, as much as there might have been some public support for this, a lot of his measures do not turn into law or get broad support in Congress. And as we've learned earlier, he only served his one term. He had quite a few um, hills to climb, from the energy crisis to the Iran hostage situation. He doesn't win a second election. Maybe things might have been a little different if he had more public support, but his plans for more scaling back the war on drugs don't really come to fruition. Things really start to look a little different when we get to the 80s, though. This is Nancy Reagan, First Lady, wife of President Reagan, and she launched the Just Say No campaign, which was aimed for children, actually. And to dive deep into it, you really just need to read the logo, right? It was geared towards children with the mentality of just say no to drugs as kind of an avenue towards keeping it out of your life. Some critics of the measure claim that it was an oversimplification, that it was kind of not targeted to all members of society. As far as its impacts, there hasn't been any true correlation drawn between this campaign and successful decrease in drug use in America. But the bigger impact from the Reagan family would be President Reagan's signing of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. And this is an appropriations, so we're talking about money, right? But where will the money go? So when you talk about $1.7 billion, you have quite a fair amount going to education and treatment, but you also start to see the creation of mandatory minimum penalties, which have been a long-term criticism of the war on drugs. You also start to see here the prison industrial complex start to really come to play. How you'll start to see for-profit prisons start to prop up around the nation. Who, I mean, if a business is a business, a prison needs inmates to function. What you also really can tie to this Act of 1986, though, is if you look at the chart here, you start to find that there's quite a discrepancy in racial disparity in terms of drug offenses and time spent in prison. Latino and African American communities were often targeted much more severely than others. A good example of this would be powdered cocaine, which is more prevalent in white communities, having a reduced sentence as opposed to crack cocaine, which was more prevalent in minority communities. In 1990, you see an increase in spending again, but this time towards military spending as well, actually increasing the budget in terms of trying to treat it more truly as a war, right? So notice some of the phrases we're not hearing a lot of, like education, reform, treatment. We're not really seeing those words a whole lot. We're seeing more towards kind of punitive measures, military spending, and that gets extended even with Democrats as well, right? In 2000, Clinton had this Plan Colombia where we actually were trying to combat the smuggling of drugs into America by giving huge amounts of money and military equipment to countries like Colombia to try and prevent drugs from entering the United States. Plenty of people criticize this as a lot of times this money went to maybe not the most trustworthy of governments who didn't necessarily use the money as intended and used it more as restrictive measures on their own people. So a lot of problems there. Now, present day, I wanted to kind of show off this. Still very, pretty large impact the war on drugs has on America. This is statistics on offenses from um, kind of the crime committed, right? So like A through M is kind of the crime, and clearly this E one is the largest. And if you scroll down, you see E is drug offenses, right? So 45% of inmates in federal prisons are from drug offenses. So clearly, this is something that's still a big part of our society, even though we have started to see some shift in the war on drugs, right? Like, I guess the most common topic discussed is the change on punitive measures towards marijuana, right? The green states are ones that have legalized recreational medical use, the blue states, medical use. So it's clearly like a shift, but I mean, just as Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971 on, no one's ever declared the war on drugs off. So hopefully you at least have little bit of an understanding now of the history of this when people bring it up and can better understand it. I'll post a few more kind of fun history videos like this. But remember, if you got concerns about your grade, please reach out and we can discuss it. I'll talk to you soon.